Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel. This is Glossy Philosophy. My name is Jansen Binman. Make sure that you are subscribed to this channel. Give this video a thumbs up because today we are doing a book talk on the amazing Oscar Wilde's The Picture of Dorian Gray, so stay tuned. The Picture of Dorian Gray is something that we've probably all read either in high school or college, or at least we're familiar with the story. But just in case you're not, here's a quick synopsis. Dorian Gray is a young gentleman. He's a teenager. He's in the prime of his life at this particular moment in history. He is so beautiful that he attracts the attention of a painter, Basil, who wants to paint his portrait. And while he's painting his portrait, one of Basil's friends come in, Lord Henry Wotton. So Lord Henry is a very classic Oscar Wilde character. He is definitely seen in the importance of being earnest and also in the ideal husband. He's the guy that tells you how it is. He's funny, he goes against the grain, and yet there's always an element of truth in everything that he says, but he says things that we would never say to one another, and certainly not in polite society. So Lord Henry Wotton is watching this portrait take place and he thinks it's stupendous, and he gets kind of a scheme in his mind. He is definitely a schemer and the person that moves the motion of the story, even though it is all about Dorian Gray and his own corruption. He sees this beautiful youth standing before him and he wants to spoil him. Basically, he wants to bring a little bit of ugliness into this beauty because he is too beautiful. Now, we've seen these themes before in other literature to come, but we'll put a pin in that for a moment. There's a pivotal conversation that takes place while Basil is having a break from painting this portrait of Dorian Gray. Dorian Gray and Lord Henry have a little chat, and it completely changes Dorian Gray's outlook on life and how he feels about himself, how he feels about the world, and everything. From that moment on, Dorian Gray starts to become corrupt and ugly and just kind of a horrid person little by little by little, and is heavily influenced by Lord Henry. By the end of the story, spoiler alert, we find out that this beautiful portrait that Basil has painted of Dorian Gray is actually reflecting the soul of Dorian Gray, and while Dorian Gray does not change at all, the portrait changes based on Dorian Gray's awful, evil, horrendous deed. And in the end, Dorian Gray dies, and he's the one to commit suicide, murder on himself, whatever you want to call it. And that is Dorian Gray. So there's a couple themes running through this, right? And I felt like when I was rereading this that a lot of things that hadn't popped out at me popped out this time. It feels a little Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde. It certainly feels along the lines of Ayn Rand, who will come later in history and write about how when things are so beautiful you have to add some ugliness to them, or you have to preserve them and completely destroy them. And we find these themes in here. We also find themes of beauty and what it means to be a young man and have desires that you can't act out on, and if you do, what does that do to your soul? Now, of course, we have to take into account that Oscar Wilde went through a few editions, a few adaptations of Dorian Gray, and I was reading up on not only Oscar Wilde but also the process of getting Dorian Gray to what we know it is now. And originally there was a lot more homosexual tones in the book. So this time, after I'd read that, rereading this book takes on a completely different meaning than if you don't know that, because there's so many hints that Lord Henry and Dorian Gray are perhaps actually lovers, and if they're not lovers, they want to be, or at least are very interested in each other in more than just friends. Lord Henry has several portraits and pictures of Dorian Gray in his own house, and his wife comments on it. They even take a house together at one point. So it is absolutely a reflection on what's going on in England and how to deal with all of these feelings and what happens if you do. I think the interesting thing about this is that you can really hone in on that idea of homosexuality in England during Oscar Wilde's time. That is the thing that eventually gets Oscar Wilde into major trouble or we can focus on these ideas of beauty and what it means to be beautiful and stay beautiful forever. And if you are beautiful, are you allowed to get away with more than if you are ugly? And if you do these awful deeds, do you actually show them on your face? And that's a little bit more what I want to focus on, because I'm so intrigued with this idea of beauty and youthfulness. I'm 38. I'm heading into middle age. I'm heading into a big transition in my own life and my body and my skin and all of these things. I can already feel it happening this year. And I look at actresses and I look at models and I look at people on YouTube, and everyone is talking about fillers and plastic surgery and Botox and all of these things that you can do to help maintain that idea of youth. And I think if we take that idea and put it on top of Dorian Gray and read it through that lens, it becomes a very modern understanding of what we're all kind of going through. And am I still beautiful? Am I still desirable even though I'm past the prime of my life? We are living much longer than we were during Oscar Wilde's time. We are definitely taking better care of ourselves, but the skin, the outside of us, our shells do start to deteriorate. And I love that Oscar Wilde had this idea of taking that away and putting it in a portrait so that you can actually see your soul on canvas and see whatever you're doing, is that actually having an impact on the outside of you. And I love that idea also that Oscar Wilde didn't do it for a woman. I think that's a very obvious choice, right? It should have been like Dorian Gray or something like that, because we usually associate youth and beauty and that pursuit with witches and sorceresses and women who are past 40 who are searching for that fountain of youth. But this time, it is a young man who needs to stay looking young and then happens to basically lose control of his life. So I love that Oscar Wilde did that. I love that he put it on to a man, and then when you're looking at his portrait, you get to imagine as the reader what that must look like. He describes it a little bit, and in my head it looks completely grotesque. So make sure that you tune in for Friday's makeup tutorial, because it's going to be really fun. There is absolutely something that Oscar Wilde hit on, and it's like, what we eat, what we do, how we live our lives do actually show on our skin. But if we are actually getting fillers and facelifts and Botox and all of this stuff, we can kind of erase the sins of our past. And our sins could just be like, we drink too much caffeine, or we like sugar a little bit more than we should. It doesn't necessarily have to mean that we're murdering people or causing great pain to others, but it could be. And there still is this idea of, if you are a horrible person, your skin, your face, how you hold yourself will reveal itself to you. So I find that whole conversation throughout the book really, really interesting. I also felt this time reading this book that Lord Henry was almost a book unto himself. He has so many humorous, intriguing, interesting things to say throughout the book. He almost takes over the story, and it feels like Oscar Wilde is, I don't know if Oscar Wilde agrees with Lord Henry, if it's his way of kind of just letting some things out into the open, into society. But whenever Oscar Wilde creates these characters who go against the grain and say whatever they want to say in slightly a polite, slightly not polite way, I just find that so fascinating, because how many of us feel comfortable saying what we actually want to say? Lord Henry must feel very comfortable with himself, with his place in society, and just letting things out that nobody else has the courage to say. And yet we never find out what Lord Henry looks like as the time passes. We have like 18 to 20 years between when Lord Henry and Dorian Gray first speak and then towards the end of the book. So we know that time has passed and he must be looking older, but we don't really get that description of him, even though he's maybe not the best kind of person. Not as bad as Dorian Gray, but not a great person either, and we don't really get that description from Oscar Wilde about if his face is starting to show some of the signs of the sins that he has done. So that's really interesting to just kind of pinpoint as well. And of course, kind of going full circle with just this idea of if you are beautiful, if you are considered beautiful, if you are youthful, you are allowed to get away with so many things, because when you walk in a room, people light up and they see you and they just, you know, are in awe of your beauty. And what does that feel like for Dorian Gray? And he starts to become really, really obsessed with his own portrait and making sure that nobody sees what he actually looks like, what his soul actually looks like. And I also love that at the end it is him and nobody else that destroys the portrait. He's the one who actually slices it through, and when he does that, he actually ends up killing himself, even though he didn't quite. So that's a really interesting thing that Oscar Wilde has done. Did Dorian Gray commit suicide? Did he commit murder? How did that happen? Of course, there's a little bit of that magical element in there, but him not knowing that when he sliced the portrait that they were going to do a flip, because when the police come, they find this old, grotesque, awful, hideous looking creature. I think he's called a creature on the floor, and this beautiful portrait of a young man with a slice through it. So they have flipped, and he has become the portrait, and the portrait has become what he's been looking like. And it's just, I just love the end of that. I think it's the perfect way to end, that it's not Sybil's brother or anybody else that he's hurt throughout the book. It's himself. He takes back control of his life and he ends it, and he stops the madness, really. The only other thing I want to point out is Sybil herself. So if you're not familiar with the story, Sybil is the actress that Dorian Gray falls in love with in the beginning, and before he does any evil, horrible deeds, he is full on in love with this young woman. She's an actress in a local theater who puts on lots of Shakespeare plays, and Lord Henry says, "Oh, you fell in love with Juliet," and he names all the Shakespeare heroines because that's who she's played. And we realize very quickly that Dorian is in love with the idea of Sybil, but not Sybil herself. They don't even really introduce themselves as their real names. She calls him Prince Charming, and he, you know, really almost thinks of her as Juliet and all the other heroines. And the problem, of course, comes when Dorian Gray asks Lord Henry and Basil to come watch her and see, like, this is my love, this is the love of my life. But he's already told Sybil that he loves her, and so for her, acting becomes impossible. She can't act in love anymore because she is in love. And of course, that idea of a professional actress all of a sudden falling in love and then not being able to act in love doesn't make any sense, but it fits with the story. So after that, Dorian Gray goes backstage and he is so horrible. I mean, it is like one of the most brutal scenes to read because she is pouring her heart out to him and telling him how much she loves him, and she'll never be a great actress again because of the depth of her love for him. And he is utterly disgusted with her, and if only she had continued to be a great actress, they could have been married and had a wonderful life, which of course, as the book goes on, we know is impossible because he becomes such a wretched character. And just the pitifulness of Sybil and the innocence of Sybil, we see that juxtaposition right away, that Dorian Gray is no longer on that innocent scale like Sybil. He has started to go onto the dark side, and she can't stand it and ends up ending her own life. So it's a really intense way to kind of kick off the horribleness of Dorian Gray, and yet it's also the perfect way to end his innocence at the same time. So that is the book talk of Dorian Gray by Oscar Wilde. I hope you will read it. Please leave comments below, your favorite parts, things that surprised you, things that shocked you, things that you're still thinking about. I normally do fashion videos every Wednesday, beauty videos every Friday. Make sure that you are checking below in the description box because I have the next books for 2025 listed below, where you can get them, what the titles are, who they're by, all that good stuff, so you can start reading and take part in the book talks as well. And I will see you very soon in the next one. Bye.